English defence, which arises after the opening moves 1c4, b6, or 1d4, e6, 2c4, b6, followed by the subsequent fianchetto of the Black Queen's bishop, derives its name principally from its popularisation in the 1970s by the English grandmasters Keane, Steen, and most noteworthily, Miles. The defence perhaps revolves principally around the struggle for the central square e4. Now, there exists an already well-established complex of openings concerned with that struggle, and that is the Nimzo-Indian and Queen's Indian defences. Throughout this survey, opportunities for comparison with, and frequently direct transposition into, that complex of openings will occur. The defence was very popular in the late 70s and early 80s, but has fallen into relative disuse nowadays. This I find somewhat surprising because the established theory seems to be holding up quite well from Black's point of view, and in the survey we'll be showing you some interesting new ideas as well. To begin with, I shall be looking at systems where White plays an early knight f3, and Black, having fianchettoed the Queen Bishop, takes the opportunity to capture on f3, at a moment when he thinks it will grant him an advantageous pawn structure. Then, we shall look at systems where White plays an early e2 to e4, but does not advance his d-pawn 2 squares. And conversely, then systems where the early d2 to d4 is played, but the e-pawn isn't advanced. Some players, having played the early d2 to d4, have tried to gain a space advantage in the centre by following up with an early d5, and we shall be looking at that idea. Next comes the systems where White takes up the gauntlet thrown down by Black. So after, for example, c4, b6, d4, e6, he erects the big pawn centre with 3 e4. And after bishop b7, it's a question of how he will defend it. Knight c3 is very natural, after which Black will reinstate the pressure on the e-pawn with the pin bishop to b4. This pin has proved quite effective, and so some people, when playing White, have looked at other ways of defending the threatened e-pawn. f3, queen c2, and perhaps most critically, bishop to d3. In the position before us on the board, we have one of the most heated theoretical debates of the late 1970s. Very strong grandmasters like Sakis and Miles were prepared to essay this pawn gambit as Black. Few people nowadays are prepared to do so because after e takes f5, no one is convinced that Black can get away with a complex sequence bishop takes g2, queen to h5 check, g6 forced, f takes g6, bishop g7, pawn takes pawn check, king f8, now the star move knight e2. The consensus seems to be that these complications after the capture 5 e takes f5 work out in White's favour. So, some alternative methods of trying to make this work were dreamt up. I myself once played the gambit bishop to b4 check, king f1, not a bad move here since it looks after the g2 pawn and White has a pawn up, and now knight to f6. I once won a spectacular game in this line at Copenhagen in 1981 against Erik Brøndum, the chess writer from Denmark, but I don't regard it as fully viable for Black, imaginative though it may be. So to return to the position after White's fourth move, the attempt to reach equality with 4 knight c6 has been tried, the point being that after White defends the d4 pawn, with knight e2 let's say, Black can then win the pair of bishops with knight to b4 and subsequent capture of the d3 bishop. However, even this method of improvement, quite a different idea than gambiting or grabbing a rook, the other two tries Black put into operation, even this does not strike me as fully adequate to reach equality. What we're going to look at in the course of this survey is
an idea brought in by Tony Miles to circumvent this position after 4 bishop d3. And the new idea is really to retract the previous 2 moves. Back goes the black bishop to c8. And the white king bishop to f1. And at this point give check on b4. Now the moves knight to c3 or knight to d2 steer play back into established lines of the English defence, where black's situation is not regarded as so unfavourable. So bishop to d2 is the move granting the game independent character. And Miles' idea is to play an exchange of bishops. And only now, a delayed fianchetto. And after white protects that pawn, to put your king knight on h6. And he himself, one of the pioneers of the defence, once said that the whole point of the opening was to play f5. Well, black is trying to engineer this here, to get that advance in after his castle, probably. And it's an interesting and dynamic new approach to this critical problem for the English defence. And it's been dubbed, not quite certain why, the kangaroo. But to begin with, I'd like to look at some recent developments in lines where white does not try to take the opportunity which black's first move has granted him to build up a pawn centre immediately. And rather, he chooses slower lines of development. This is my game with Daniel King from the Watson-Farley-Williams tournament of May 1991 in London, where he played white, playing 2 knight to f3, black fianchettoed, and white prepared his own fianchetto. Now, there are various opportunities for transposition here with e6, knight f6 going back into a Queen's Indian, or c5 steering play towards more of a symmetrical English formation. But the English defence is a radical opening, and black's next move is definitely an English defence move. Capturing the knight on f3. White recaptures. And now c5. And at move 5, play is already, in a sense, quite critical. Because white's next move is, in a higher meaning, forced. If he dallies and doesn't play d2 to d4, prefers some casual developing move like bishop g2, for example, then black can immediately launch an iron grip on the d4 square. And if you look at the game Kribo-Schussler, you'll see just how easy it is for black to build up in the middle game, and how hard it is for white to create chances for himself due to his self-inflicted backward d-pawn. Daniel King was well aware of that, and played 5d4. Now, this is the critical test of black's capture of the knight, and various formations for the black pieces had been tried, all of them commencing, of course, with a capture on d4. If you look at the appended game McNabb-Martin, you'll see a very impressive build-up by the player of the white pieces, which was only spoiled by a miraculous escape allowed to the defending black player. The consensus seems to be amongst grandmasters that after c takes d4, queen takes d4, white probably is better. Sooner or later that pair of bishops does tend to make itself felt. So the recent development was that at move 5, I made certain black keeps control of the d4 square, but in rather an unusual way. Knight to c6. Innovation. Well, there's no question about white's reply to this. Taking on c5 is senseless. Black would soon play g6, bishop g7, and establish an iron grip on d4. d5 is played. And in comes the knight to d4. Once again, g6 and bishop g7 is in the offing, so little question about white's reply. Bishop to e3. But here already at move 7, black has more than one option. His best move may have been just to advance the pawn to e5, when the position is rich in possibilities for both sides. For the time being, white's bishop pair isn't making itself felt so well because of the relatively blocked nature of the position. And you can obviously envisage several ways in which black could hope to complete development. e5 is certainly a move to be taken very seriously there, even though, as I say, there are no theoretical examples of it as yet. What I in fact played was knight back to f5. And one of the clear ideas of this is just to play g6 and bishop g7, and then hop back into the famous d4 square later on. Well, Daniel King, like me, had been raised on the same chess manuals that tell you all about the virtues of the pair of bishops, and he kept his bishop now by moving it to d2. It's not the only square to move it to. Indeed, it's not entirely clear to me that it has to move. Bishop h3. Or bishop d3 are certainly moves to be considered here. And after the straightening out of the white pawn structure, with knight takes e3, we are left with an uncharted middle game. Well, as I say, King put the bishop on d2. Some really unusual formations might have resulted after the equally plausible bishop f4 move. For example, g6, as projected, intending fianchetto. Might try now g4, intending to meet knight back to d4 with bishop e5, forcing win of a pawn. And then the extraordinary possibility of bishop to h6 is on, since bishop e5 can be met with bishop to g7. And if bishop captures on h6, black takes back with, of course, the queen knight, which is some of the strangest positions from the opening you ever saw. But there are no strategical defects in black's game, and he can obviously hope to unravel with f6 or f5, knight to f7, etc. White could, if he wished, just drop back to g3, offering us the possibility of a unique pawn structure after knight takes g3, h takes g3, bishop to g7, with another position I find very hard to assess, certainly rich in possibilities for both sides. King in fact played 8 bishop d2, intending to challenge with this bishop on the key a1 to h8 diagonal. I played the consistent fianchetto, g6, and he challenged with bishop c3. Bishop g7, which he took, and after my recapture, faced quite an unusual situation. It's not often in Grandmaster chess, in fact it's almost certainly a unique instance, that after 10 moves the only developed piece is the black queen knight on g7. Nevertheless, I think you'll agree the play's been quite logical up until now, and black still has eyes on that key d4 square, for example, hopping in via the route h6 to f5. In this particular instance, the white bishop doesn't have all that much scope. So here, 5 knight to c6, the novelty, worked quite well on its only outing so far at Grandmaster level. It's quite a logical move. The whole focus is on the square d4, the logical follow-up to the capture on f3 being to play c5 and knight c6. The only snag is that white gains some space, but that doesn't seem to be too much of a problem from black's point of view. Well, in a later round of the very same tournament, we were to see a development of this idea of mine of capturing on f3 after white has played g3, and then black playing c5, and meeting white's advance of d4 with knight to c6. This time I was playing Nigel Davis, but in the particular setting we're going to look at now, I didn't get the timing quite right and was lucky to escape with a draw. However, the game is, I think, valuable because it throws light upon the structure of the opening as a whole, and I think clear improvements for black can be cited, which are of importance. So it went 2 knight c3, e6, 3 knight f3, bishop b7, now the fianchetto, g3, and we'll note in passing black can play c5 or d5 or knight f6, reaching recognised openings. Could also play bishop b4. Not quite as orthodox, but looks completely okay to me. But, as I said, we took on f3. White took back. And the c5 advance, hoping to clamp on d4. So d4 has to be played immediately if you're going to play it with white. And Nigel did. But here, certainly correct for black is to take on d4, reaching that slightly inferior middle game we referred to earlier. Since that is his best move, it seems that c5 probably wasn't right here, and we'll look at an improvement later on. As I said, I tried knight c6, as I had done versus king, in an analogous position, and Davis, of course, advanced, the correct move. In we go to d4, and he challenged once again with bishop e3. Well, here by analogy I could have played e5, but I'd be a tempo down this time, and I suspect that some sort of line-opening device like f4 will prise open the position to a degree at least in white's favour. However, that's certainly the best chance, I think, is to play e5. I played knight f5, and Davis very adroitly spotted his chance to get a development lead and went bishop h3. And here too, probably black's best is to play not the consistent move knight to h6 as I played, trying to keep the clamp on d4 open, but to vary from that and take on e3 and be slightly worse. However, I tried to hang on to d4 and played knight from g8 to h6. Comes a very good move from Davis. Queen a4. g6. White castled. Now I become aware of the pressure on my position if I played bishop g7, staring down the d file. So I tried to bail out by knight takes e3. F takes e3. Now the pawn on e6 is actually en prise. E takes d5. But white played very dynamically indeed. Rook a d1. Obviously that pawn on d5 can't move. Bishop g7. Rook takes d5. f5. White doubled, and the only hope was to give up this pawn with castles. White chose to go into the endgame. Black is clearly not without some hope of salvation here. Did some further damage to the pawn structure by capturing on c3 and developing his last piece with rook to e8. Davis protected the pawn with king f2. Tactical trick, knight g4 check. Follow if he takes with the pawn, I recapture with the pawn with check, which is quite helpful for me. I took with the bishop. I took back. He advanced f4. Well, black did actually succeed in pulling off a draw from this position, but he was rather fortunate to do so. Davis should have capped his imaginative play with a little more accurate endgame technique. What this shows, I think, is that the idea of c5 and knight c6 doesn't quite work with one tempo less. Well, I think better than c5 is for black to advance with 5d5 and try to make something of his superiority in pawn structure. So if white plays the plausible d4, black should now, I think, play c6 and try, if he's lucky, to get in a quick bishop b4 and take off that knight on c3. This, I think, is a better way of proceeding and quite a viable one. Before leaving it, though, I'd like to mention to you one of the most extraordinary games in chess literature, which was played in 1979 between Grandmaster Bilek and Grandmaster now, International Master then, Schüssler from Sweden. After d5, d4, he took on c4, did Mr. Harry Schüssler. White recaptured with his bishop, and black played again c6, hoping, as with the move order I recommend, to exploit the isolated d4 pawn. But he's in for a rude awakening because white just advanced d5. Black took with the e-pawn, and white took back with a knight. The problem being that if black takes again, white takes back with the queen, and black will suffer material loss on a8. Well, what happened now is really extraordinary. Schuster played knight to e7, and Bilek, with a flourish, played knight to f6 check, and looked around triumphantly at the crowd of people watching the board. Very clever idea, winning the black queen. Schuster immediately recaptured, having thought for quite a while over his previous move, and offered a draw. Oh, of course not, said Schuster, said Bilek, and captured on f7 with check, winning the black queen. But appearances can be deceptive. Sure enough, the black queen vanishes from the board, but it became apparent to Mr. Bilek after knight d5 that his queen wasn't going anywhere. It's behind bars, and black threatens bishop b4 check, winning it back. After a long thought, he could find nothing better than castling. There is nothing better. And then, by the seesaw device of perpetually attacking the white queen, the game was agreed drawn. One of the most extraordinary games in chess literature. To continue looking at ideas where white doesn't take his opportunity to advance with an early d4, after knight c3, bishop b7, e4, e6, a variety of plans have been tried. Firstly, in the game Albert Miles from 1980, a3 was played, a cryptic move presumably designed to stop the bishop coming to b4, a natural enough developing square. However, Miles demonstrated very simple equality with knight to f6, e5, and the advanced knight to e4. Another line was seen in Lubojevich Miles from 1986, where Lubo played 4b3. And Miles tried the same idea, knight to f6, e5, and now knight to e4. Well, a complicated game began, and in a tricky middle game with chances for both sides, it was actually Lubo who emerged the victor. The only known example I've been able to find in Grandmaster practice of the plausible move knight e2 was in a game from the active chess tournament in Oviedo in Spain at the end of 1992 between Victor Korchnoi and Daniel King. King played knight to f6 in this position. Now, by comparison with the games we just looked at, you might think that after e5, black was going knight e4. But actually it's not too good an idea here, because white takes, black recaptures, and then immediately white gains time by playing his knight to c3, which isn't advantageous from black's point of view. Might just be playable, though. Daniel explained to me that his intention was, after the advance e4 to e5, to go back home with knight g8, followed by the undermining move d7 to d6. And since white must lose further time before developing his king's bishop, i.e. by moving the knight from e2, this seems to be an entirely adequate equalizing method. What Korchnoi actually did is to play knight to g3. Actually, this move doesn't impress me. I think the best move for white here is d3. After knight g3, Danny just played c5. Bishop e2, knight c6. White castled. And after g6, we just have a perfectly satisfactory middle game for black with a good clamp on the d4 square. It's unusual to come across a valuable opening novelty at move 4, but king's knight f6 does appear to be one. The point is that e5 isn't very good for white, because after the retreat, the knight on e2 isn't well placed to support the pawn at e5, and it's, as I say, it's blocking in the development of the white king bishop. Well, the development of the knight to f3 is, of course, perfectly logical and has been frequently seen. And the classic English defence response is to keep up the pressure on that e4 square with the development of bishop b4. If instead of bishop b4, knight to f6, a normal English opening, that position arose in 1975 in a famous game between Romanishin and Petrosian, where Oleg Romanishin produced the astonishing innovation of developing his bishop on d3 ahead of the d-pawn, with the idea of subsequently dropping it back to c2. He went on to win a brilliant sacrificial game. This probably explains why, in this position, a few people were moved to also put their bishop on d3. But here it's a different kettle of fish, and black has had little difficulty in demonstrating equality. Knight to e7, the English defence development. Both sides can castle. And in a game between Hübner and Miles from Bad Lauterberg in 1977, White actually very quickly came into a lost position here. He went rook to e1, Black advanced f5, and now e5 is a really bad move from a player of Hübner's class, because after knight to g6, Black's plan is simple: take the knight on f3 and play knight c6 and win a pawn, which is exactly what he did, and he went on to win the game very easily. So to go back to the position after both sides have castled, in a recent game between Lopez and Eslon from Palma in 1991, White challenged the bishop immediately with a3. But this is no problem from Black's point of view. He's quite happy to take. White recaptures. And then the move which Tony Miles described as the whole point of the English defence, f5. And what happened now was really a confirmation of theoretical conclusions which had been held for some time, that this line isn't a threat to Black. White played rook to e1, Black just swapped off in the middle twice. And swung his knight out to the newly vacated f5 square with comfortable equality, and went on to win. Another example of Black demonstrating equality against this bishop d3 setup, this time via a different plan, was in the game Gabriel against Latvian Grandmaster Cengiz from the Baden-Baden Open of 1990. From the diagram position, play proceeded 6a3. Black, of course, captured on c3, and White took back with a d-pawn. But Cengiz didn't concern himself with the advance of the f-pawn, he just strong-pointed the position. d6, castles, knight to d7, rook e1, castles. And the pawn structure is certainly not an advantage to White's pair of bishops, which are sort of bogged down in a sticky suet pudding. White could find nothing more productive than bishop g5, and Cengiz went f6, bishop dropped back to d2, queen to e8. And Black had, via a different plan this time, of course, again comfortable equality, and in fact went on to win in 29 moves. Another attempt for the advantage White has tried from the diagram position is to play 5 queen b3, challenging the bishop. Now Black certainly should not take on c3 now, as actually happened in one of the earlier games with the English defence, Schmeichel versus Miles from Reykjavik in 1976, because after the recapture he's just lost the bishop pair. In fact, the extraordinary development of this game was that Miles now took on e4 and went on to win the game in 46 moves, after queen takes on g7, queen to f6. But Jonathan Spielman pointed out White has in fact a forced win in this position. d3, bishop takes f3, queen takes g7, queen f6, and now the crafty bishop to h6. And that was the reason why the line vanished from master practice. An effective reply to 5 queen b3 is 5 knight to a6. Now the first point of this move is that if 6a3, then the white queen is hit with knight c5, and the bishop on b4 is immune to capture because queen takes b4 leads to the trapping of the white queen after a5, queen b5, c6. If instead White drops back to c2, then the sequence bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, and now capturing on e4 is very effective because the Spielman trick we looked at in the last variation no longer works. If we look at d3, bishop takes f3, queen takes g7, queen f6, bishop h6. Not too surprisingly, Black can exploit his great development lead by playing queen takes bishop, queen takes rook, and now knight b3 is decisive, because if queen takes g8 check, king e7, and both the white king and queen are threatened. So if White continues more sedately with d3, Then by following up with knight e7, castles, and f5, black achieves a comfortable equality. And 5 queen b3 is rarely seen in modern praxis. Well, of course, many players of the white pieces have seen no reason to avoid the opportunity to put up some sort of pawn centre, which the move 1b6 gives them, and have chosen to advance with the pawn to d4. For example, after 2, knight c3, e6, d4, bishop b4. But of course, white doesn't have to put the 3 pawns abreast on d4, c4 and e4 if he wishes. e3 is a good sensible positional move. Obviously has a lot in common with an Imzo-Indian defence. Indeed, it could well be that the objectively soundest move for black here is to play knight f6, after which we have transposed into the 4b6 variation of the Rubinstein variation of an Imzo-Indian. There are other moves for black, for example, bishop b7. And after, let's say, knight e2, once again he could play knight f6 back into an Imzo. But the English defence proper is something like f5. In fact, this was played in some games of the 70s and 80s. For example, Olofsson-Miles, where after a3, black dropped back with his bishop to d6. White tries to make something of his spatial advantage with d5. And knight to f6. Knight to d4. And here Miles played very imaginatively indeed, gambiting a pawn by castling. And after d takes e6, knight to e4, after which black developed a splendid initiative for the pawn and went on to win an excellent game. Look at my game with Suba from the Watson-Farley-Williams tournament of 1991, which continued knight h3, knight f6, f3, obviously intending to build up a big pawn centre, g6, a sensible place to put the bishop, I thought, knight f2, bishop g7, now e4. Black has a variety of plans here, maybe castling, maybe knight c6. I chose to take. And then castle. And Suba played a very interesting plan. Bishop g5. Pin is a little unpleasant, so h6. Bishop e3. Knight to c6. e5. Knight to h5, queen to g4, knight to e7, to protect the pawn, hopefully surface at f5, bishop d3, queen e8, castles, knight does indeed pop out at f5, bishop dropped back, and now d6 to attack the white centre. A very hyper-modern development indeed. Captured on d6. Black recaptured. Now the dynamic move d5 led to great complications with chances for both sides. One of the most popular early responses to the English defence was to attempt to gain an advantage for white, not by putting a broad pawn centre up, but by gaining space through the advanced d4, d5. So, for example, c4, b6, d4, e6, d5. In the game Karpov-Miles from Las Palmas 1977, white quickly established a big space advantage and won through a crushing bind very quickly. Subsequent developments, however, suggested that black had a few ways of getting equality from this position. One such move, which we have found no concrete examples of, strangely enough, is to give check. We'll look at some of the subsequent attacks on the white centre that follow this bishop check, because some of the moves we should be looking at lead to transpositional or similar variations. I think the best way for black to equalise here is just to play 3 knight f6. And if here, for example, the move a3, black can exploit white's move order with the effective bishop to a6, exclamation mark. It seems a very good equalising move indeed. In systems involving the early d5 for white, the question of move order is quite important. So, for example, after c4, b6, d4, bishop b7, d5, e6, the equalising methods we just looked at for black will no longer apply. He's already committed his queen's bishop. After e4, the game Tim and Spassky from 1983 seemed to indicate the best equalising method for black, which is bishop to b4 check. And now knight to c3 would allow the familiar pawn jab f5, totally dislocating the white pawn centre, which would also be the reply to knight d2. And after bishop to d2, Spassky demonstrated that queen e7 is an excellent equalising move. Indeed, after this game, the move order with d5 and e4 was never seen again at master level. Another treatment from the diagram position is to play not e4, but a3, taking away that bishop check. Well, a variety of responses were cooked up against this. In my opinion, one of the best ones for black is to resort to a double fianchetto development, as I did. I think I was the first person to try it, in my game as black against the Swedish master Åkesson in 1981. g6, knight f3, bishop g7. Here the move f5 immediately was already an interesting possibility. e4, knight e7, bishop e2, castles, knight c3, f5. This is the whole point, to try to dismantle the arrogantly set up white centre. If white advances with e5, well then knight a6 to c5, piling on the pressure. So Åkesson tried for an advantage a different way, took on f5. I already captured with the knight. That's now a very nicely placed piece. He castled. Queen e7. Bishop g5. Queen f7. Queen c2. Here I completed my queenside development with knight a6, and we append the remaining moves of the game, which black won through quite a nice attacking idea. From the diagram position, in my opinion, black has another possibility apart from the immediate 4g6, which is to try 4c6. And I have come across no examples of this yet in practical play. After, presumably, e4, black could now, I think, play the fianchetto with g6 and a subsequent f5, leading to great complications. The game Suber-Schuster, which we append, has some similarities with that structure. Alternatively, he might exchange immediately on d5 and then play bishop c5, or try the immediate bishop c5. One point of that move being that the push b4 does not work because of bishop takes f2 check. And then queen to f6 check, picking up the rook in the corner. That's only one variation, however. There are many other possibilities. But I think that 4c6, probably in conjunction with the double fianchetto, could well be a good try for black. Now let's look at some of the most testing variations of all, where white takes the opportunity to erect a big pawn centre against black's hyper-modern defence, and black then attempts to batter it as best he can, with every means at his disposal. So, for example, 2d4, bishop b7, knight c3, e6, e4. There's the centre. And bishop b4. The assault against it begins. The most common move here is perhaps the natural developing move, bishop to d3. We'll look at a few others later on. Once again, black has to get on with his attack on that centre, otherwise white will just solidify it and have the advantage. So f5. A move which can't be taken, obviously, because of the capture of the pawn on g2 and the rook in the corner. Well, the most usual continuation here has been to give check on h5, a finesse, because the queen's going to e2 next move. And there have been some examples of the immediate queen e2, though, however, where once again black carries on. Most thematic move, putting pressure on the e4 pawn, which can't move. A game from the 1976 Haifa Olympiad between Dutchman Sissonko and England's Raymond Keane showed black achieving comfortable equality. Bishop g5 plays Sissonko, pinning the knight. Keane swapped off in the middle. Sissonko took back. Black chose to give check, doubling the pawns. Recaptured. And further simplification occurred. White, of course, took on f6. Black recaptured. Queen takes e4. Knight c6. Clearly black has no problems either in pawn structure or in development, and had a comfortable equality. To return to 6 queen h5 check then, black naturally interposes with the pawn, and white must protect his e4 pawn, so back goes the queen. And by analogy with the previous variation, and quite consistent with what we've been looking at, knight to f6. This position has occurred, to the best of my knowledge, on at least 3 occasions. The most noted names involved were those of Andras Adorian and Boris Spassky in a game from the 1982 Toluca Interzonal, which was a debacle to the player of the white pieces. Continued f3. After knight to c6, putting pressure on the d4 square, Adorian's next move, amazingly enough, was a losing blunder. He played e5, totally overlooking the capture of his d4 pawn. Because after queen to f2, certainly both black knights are en prise, but after knight to h5, Adorian cannot capture on d4 because of bishop to c5 trapping his queen. Still, that did not prevent him from capturing on d4. After bishop c5, he lost his queen, and the game. It's much better for white to protect the centre with bishop e3. When I played this position a couple of times in the late 70s and early 80s, against Colin Crouch, I chose to capture on e4 after having first castled. White developed his knight to h3, now to capture on e4. White took back with the pawn, and e5, leading to quite an unusual position strategically. White advanced with d5, black dropped in with knight d4, with quite a comfortable equality, and went on to win in 32 moves. I think castles is one of black's best moves. Against Glenn Fleer, I actually played f4, when white should almost certainly drop back to f2 with the bishop, preserving his centre. In fact, he took on f4, and after knight takes d4 in reply, black was already extremely comfortable, and went on to win, in fact, in 5 more moves, amazingly enough. An alternative method of bolstering the centre for white, which takes the sting out of the projected f5 move, which we saw was so effective in lines with the bishop on d3, is the robust f3. Against this, black has tried a system involving queen to h4 check, and after g3, queen to h5. The point is that the queen on h5 will help to set up the f5 lever. Even though this was successful in the game Donna Miles from 1978, it is not the particular system I would advocate. In my opinion, one of black's best chances here is to play f7 to f5, and after white captures, to play the intriguing gambit knight to h6. Also an idea of Miles, I believe. One last method we'll look at of bolstering this centre is to play queen to c2. Obviously a move with some similarity to a Nimzo-Indian. But the next move, which fits into the English defence setup, is very far from the sedate lines of the Nimzo. Queen out to h4. A remarkable concept, quite a disturbing one when players of the white pieces were meeting it for the first time in the 70s. If now d5, then black would satisfactorily dismantle the white pawn centre with f5, a theme with which by now I trust we're familiar. So it's better for white to counter the threat to e4 the only other way he can, with bishop to d3. Still f5. Very effective, because can't be captured, because the bishop takes g2, winning the rook in the corner. Probably the most critical move here for white is to play the knight to f3, attacking the black queen. When after bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3, queen g4, play is becoming very sharp indeed. In a game from 1985, white castled at this point, black captured on e4, and it looks as though his strategy has triumphed. But it's not all over yet. After knight to e5, he developed something of an initiative for his pawn. This position has been suggested to be critical for the assessment of this variation. It seems to me that after queen to h4, bishop to c2, d6, white is unlikely to get satisfactory compensation for his trapped piece. I don't think black is in much danger here. This variation seems to suggest that white's opening has already been effectively countered. In the game Farrago-Miles from 1977, white chose g3, but this is already something of a concession on the light squares and the long diagonal in particular. Black moved back, queen h5, and Farrago's plan was to play bishop e2, queen to f7, now e4 is attacked, played f3. But Miles made a total vindication of his opening by playing f takes e4, f takes e4, knight f6. Farrago chose to play d5 to do something about this pressure on his centre. And after castles, knight to f3, Miles played very well indeed with queen g6, bishop d3, queen to h5, attacking the knight, castles, knight to a6, and the whole white game is very rickety and fell to pieces in a few more moves. One of the classic English defence games, this. We've already seen some examples of an early d5 being satisfactorily met by black. You'll therefore not be too surprised to hear that 5d5 in this position isn't a headache from black's point of view. He has a variety of thematic and good responses. For example, the dismantling move f5, out with a queen to h4, delaying matters with knight e7, followed by castling on f5 perhaps. Michael Steiner suggested in such positions the plan of taking on c3 with check, and then queen to e7, to be followed perhaps by knight to a6 and castles queenside. Bit ambitious, but could well be playable. The earliest known example of this position was actually from a game in 1920 between Tartakova and Reti, where black played a good equalising move, queen e7. And this move received another outing in 1993 in a Dutch league match between Zsuzsa Polgar playing white and Jonathan Spielman black. Bishop e2 to deal with the threat along the e-file. Knight f6 played Spielman. So e5 is met with knight e4. Well, the remarkable move queen d4 was played by Tartakova, which looks quite senseless. f3 was Zeus's attempted improvement. Didn't help her much there. Spielman took off. Went to back with the c-pawn and c6, immediately threatening win of a pawn. White took, and all these moves are just accelerating Mr. Specimen's development. Knight takes c6. Zsuzsa played knight h3, hoping to reach some sort of development, and the rest of the game is played with extreme violence by Jonathan. d5, e takes d5, castles queenside. With a lot of open lines and development lead, against a rather sadly exposed Hungarian king. Bishop g5, rook h8, developing the last piece. Polgar fights gamely on, taking on f6. Spielmann alertly took back with a pawn. Schuster played knight f4. Spielmann played queen e5, hitting it. Queen d2. Now comes an attractive finale. Bishop takes c3. She took back with the pawn. If she takes with the queen, then we'd have the conclusion: queen takes f4, pawn takes c6, bishop a6, and the pin is decisive. So Schuster took back with the pawn, but after Spielmann's knight b4, things were already looking very bad for white. She tried king f2. Castles would have met with the same reply of knight takes d5. Here, knight d3 was a clever attempt to keep it all together, but Spielmann's ingenious reply, knight takes c3, forced immediate resignation. If white pins on the c-file, black plays queen takes e2 check, and likewise if knight takes e5, then rook takes d2, and win of a piece. A real crush. Some players of the white pieces have preferred to erect a pawn centre after 2d4, e6, 3e4, bishop b7, and to defend it not with the knight but with the f-pawn, f3. This possibility sidesteps the useful pin of bishop b4 with which the development of the knight was greeted. Well, one of the most consistent moves now for black is to keep hitting the centre with 4f5. And white is really pushed to maintain it at this point. If knight c3, then bishop b4 transposes back into ideas we've seen. So e takes f5 is consistent. Well, at this point, Tony Miles did once play the remarkable gambit, knight to h6, meeting bishop takes h6 with queen to h4 check, g3, and then the recapture of the bishop with the queen, when black has good compensation for one pawn. But his opponent, Hans Rey, in 1979 did not take the knight, just kept on taking pawns. F takes e6. And out came Miles' knight to f5, willingly giving away 2 pawns for a development lead and an initiative. Extremely imaginative concept. I'm not completely convinced it's 100% correct, but it worked successfully. He actually got a draw in this first use of it. Well, I don't advocate that gambit. I would recommend instead the simple recapture, e takes f5, which is a little less hair-raising. A couple of games have been played from this position. Knight to h3 is a sensible move because the f4 square looks a natural outpost for that knight. Bishop to b4 check for black. And if now bishop to d2, then black can play queen to h4 check. It's a good softening up move, this. Softens up the long diagonal. g3. And only now drop the queen back to e7 check, which is a little bit uncomfortable for white, who may be finding himself compelled to move his king to f2. So the interpolation of the knight on c3 has been preferred. And once again we see this disruptive check on h4. Useful, annoying little move. And after g3, dropping the queen back to e7 to give check. And once again, the problem with the f3 pawn means that white really has to move his king, which is not such a tragedy for him in this position. It's rather hard to get at. Another game, Sosonko Keen, this time from Germany in 1977, continued with black capturing on c3, doubling the pawns, and then rapidly castling queenside. Knight out to c6. Bishop to f4. And black castles. Obviously there's a lot of possibilities here for both sides, but the game appears to be sort of dynamically balanced hereabouts. Before leaving this section, there are 2 final unexplored ideas I'd like to recommend. The first is to play queen h4 check, and after g3, drop back with queen h5. The idea is, of course, to play f5 next move and to take back on that square with the queen. So, for example, play might continue knight h3, f5, knight f4, queen f7, white takes on f5, and black takes back with the queen. Analogous ideas have been seen of this queen h4 check, queen h5, f5 lever. This is unexplored, chances for both sides. And then there is the little move knight h6. And the idea of this is similar to queen h4 in that black wants to play f5 and take back on that square with a piece. If white now captures on h6, and of course black doesn't take back with a pawn, he interpolates first of all the queen check, and then takes back with the queen, having gained the two bishops thereby. By analogy with the pawn sacrifice of Miles we glimpsed earlier, after, for example, bishop d3, play might continue f5, bishop captures on h6, the queen check, g3, queen takes h6, he takes f5, and now black could take on f5, or play knight to c6, or play, most straightforwardly of all, queen to e3 check, with good compensation for the pawn in all cases. A straightforward way of countering 4 knight h6 is to play 5 g3, the idea being, of course, to take away the queen check from black, and therefore threaten to double and isolate the h-pawns. I think black should react against this with 5 g6, with the twin idea of setting up the advance f5, and also, of course, preparing to recapture on h6 with the bishop should white be foolish enough to take the knight, and setting up the fianchetto with bishop g7. This will lead to unexplored situations, and I see no reason why black's chances should be any the worse. White can also support his pawn centre with 2d4, e6, 3e4, bishop b7, queen c2. A move, once again, with the idea of avoiding this pin of the knight on c3. Well, the correct and consistent move here for black is not obvious, so look carefully. It's queen h4. Threatening the e4 pawn again. If white advances with d5, then naturally we start hitting the centre with f5. Knight c3 would allow the pin, bishop b4. And so the move most often seen in this position is knight to d2. Now bishop b4, of course, reinstating the threat to the e4 pawn. Bishop d3, f5, reaching another sort of classic position for the English defence. You'll remember that earlier on we looked at the game Farrago-Miles, where the knight was on c3. Here it's on d2, the same position. The e4 pawn is under threat. What's white going to do? Well, g3 doesn't help him very much. The queen drops back and the white centre starts to crumble and the black strategy is successful. The most consistent move is knight to f3. Now, this position actually occurred in the game from the candidates match in 1977 between Poligajski and Korchnoi. And Korchnoi took on d2 with check, whereupon Poligajski obligingly played king to f1. And only after the black queen moved did he recapture the bishop. But this king f1 move was certainly unnecessary, and far superior is to play bishop takes d2. When Korchnoi intended queen g4, but during the game he noted the possibility for white now of knight e5, which is a way of employing tactics to break the pressure on his centre. The black queen has only one consistent move to take the g2 pawn, and now white castles queenside. We shan't go into this complex position in too much depth, but the consensus was that after f takes e4, bishop e2, notwithstanding his two extra pawns, black is in grave difficulties. The rook g1, threats to his queen, and a big development lead for white leading to clear attacking chances. So for this reason, the move bishop takes d2 check, even though Korchnoi used it successfully in the candidates match, was viewed as not really playable. As a consequence of this, I took a look at the position after knight f3 and decided that black had a better move in queen g4, which actually received an outing in 1992 in a Lincolnshire League game between Hazel playing white and myself playing black. The immediate threat for black is to take the g2 pawn, and then, in response to rook g1, he can capture the knight on f3, because the defending knight on d2 is pinned. Therefore, a3 is not a very productive move for white here. So strong is that threat that castles seems by far the most natural way of dealing with it. And then black, of course, captures on d2. Now white cannot take back with the bishop because of f takes e4, forking and winning immediately. He could certainly take back with a knight, and it seems to me black could choose between knight to c6, knight to e7, or, possibly the best, capturing on e4, with counter chances in either case. A more complicated try is to play knight e5. Once again suspending recapturing the bishop on d2 and attacking the queen instead. This actually happened in the game with Hazel. I played queen h4, maintaining the attack on the e4 pawn. You drop the knight back to f3. Of course I could repeat the position with queen g4, but tried for more with queen h5. And now unquestionably white's best move here is to take with the knight on d2, when once again black could choose between knight e7, knight c6, or taking on e4. He in fact made the error of taking with the bishop, and I played knight f6. This was a position I had analysed in the mid-1980s, concluding black had excellent counter chances, and this game appeared to confirm that. The white centre is crumbling. If he takes on f5, I of course take on f3, with great effect. What actually happened was he attempted to maintain things with d5, but after f takes e4, bishop takes e4, black had a variety of very strong continuations at his disposal. In the event he just castled and went on to win because of the crumbling white pawn centre very quickly. So this does appear to be a vindication of this improvement on the Korchnoi-Poligajski game of 7 queen g4. Quite an important improvement. Some of the most critical lines of the English defence arise from this position, where white defends the centre with bishop d3. The first reaction for black was to play f5, thematic and seemingly preventing the capture on f5, but things are not so simple. After e4 takes f5, bishop takes g2, black does indeed ensure the win of the rook in the corner. But the check, queen h5 check, forces the reply g6, king e7 being impossible because of queen g5 check, winning the bishop on g2. So g6, now of course white captures, with the terrible threat of g7 discovered check, and therefore black's next move is forced, bishop to g7. After g takes h7 check, king f8, the consensus eventually was arrived at that the sequence knight e2, a surprising move here, not capturing the knight immediately, knight to f6, queen to h4, bishop takes rook in the corner, and now bishop to g5, led to a situation where black's chances were inferior, notwithstanding his temporary extra rook. White very, very quickly builds up an attack on the g-file, perhaps involving knight to f4 to g6, or knight to f4 to h5 as well. As I say, this variation was eventually completely discredited. So, other ways of dealing with this 4 bishop d3 variation had to be found. To begin with, people tried playing f5, and after the capture, giving a check on b4, so as to reply to the forced reply king f1, because now g2 really is en prise, with either the gambit knight to f6, which, imaginative though it looks, is hard to believe is really viable, or recapturing on f5. This was actually tried in a game between Serouan and Schussler in 1979, and white played very energetically indeed to show how to get the advantage. He went c5, and the point of that move is to trap the bishop with a3 and b4. So black must capture. Now e3. Black feels obliged to return the pawn to get the bishop out. Bishop takes c4. Bishop d6. But now probably simply queen b3, amongst other moves, leaves white better. The check on b4 immediately doesn't look too promising. Some people have even tried the move king f1 now with white, trying to argue that black must lose time by retreating the bishop. But the simple interpolation bishop d2 is likely to result in a rather prospectless middle game for black, where he simply has less space. The move for knight c6 was tried a few times by Tony Miles, the idea being that after white protects d4 with knight f3, white will have to concede the two bishops to knight b4. This gives black some compensation for his spatial inferiority. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that this probably still does leave white a little bit more comfortable in the ensuing middle games. Black is a bit cramped. I'm not convinced 4 knight c6 does the trick. The move for queen h4, a really radical try, was pioneered by Hungarian Grandmaster Ferenc. Now, if white plays queen c2 or queen e2, the thematic f5 seems fine for black. If knight c3, then the move f5 leads us into sharp and, as far as I'm aware, uncharted territory. White can't take that pawn because his g2 pawn falls, and after knight f3, queen g4, we have a very, very obscure position indeed. Consider h3. Queen takes g2, rook g1, queen takes h3, rook to g3, when black might acquiesce in a repetition or try for more with queen h1 check, rook g1, queen h5, rook g5, queen f7. And if white were to take on f5, maybe bishop d6. And white has not yet demonstrated he has refuted black's avant-garde concept. Well, Ferenc's move has been most often met by 5 knight to f3, attacking the queen, and then queen to g4. Now the first thing to note is that white can here, if he wishes, force a draw by h3, which this time does not permit black to escape with his queen. Queen takes g2, rook g1, take the h-pawn, and now this perpetual attack. Black goes to h6, then rook g3, and only a man of extraordinary character would play g5 here as black to try to escape the perpetual. So white has usually preferred to castle, gambiting a pawn. The question is black's defence adequate? He takes this pawn, threatening to take on f3 to exchange the queens. White takes back. And the position following knight c3, queen to b7, occurred, for example, in the game Fleer-Ferenc of 1981. Well, black won that game quite quickly. My initial assessment was that here white had a lot of compensation for the pawn, with either rook to e1 or bishop to g5. Now I'm not so certain. Black has no real weaknesses in his position, doesn't lag that far behind in development, and might well be able to set up a reasonable defence here. Tony Miles came up with another new idea for black, starting with bishop b4 check and move 2, bishop d2, exchanging, and now playing b6, a delayed fianchetto. And the point emerges after knight c3, bishop b7, e4. The black is going to try and set up f5 under somewhat different circumstances, with the move knight to h6. And this extraordinary beast became dubbed the kangaroo. Not entirely certain why, but that's its name, the kangaroo defence. Now, it was first deployed, I think I'm right in saying, at the Ostend tournament in 1991. A couple of games show some of the themes of the kangaroo. After knight f3, knight castles, bishop d3. He could now play f5 if he wished. Miles chose to play knight c6 in his game with the Soviet Grandmaster Vishmanovin. White castled long. Black played knight e7 to set up f5. which Mishvanovic chose to cross over with d5. And black played d6 with a cramped but solid structure. He could now presumably set up the move e5 and only then f5, also perhaps having dropped the bishop back to c8 first of all. Well, Mishvanovic chose to transform the pawn structure at this stage with pawn takes e6. But I'm not sure I understand this decision, because after black recaptured, he stood perfectly well with good control of the centre and no weaknesses, and in fact went on to win in 61 moves. Well, on the second occasion that the kangaroo came bounding out into the world, international master Keith Arkle, at the same Ostend event, chose to play d5 against Miles. Black castled. I played knight f3, and the characteristic English defence move f5 appeared. Bishop d3, and very adroitly black played knight a6, coming to c5 with tempo. White castled. Knight to c5. Bishop to c2, and only now does black dismantle the white centre. He exchanged again on e4, and then played knight to g4, the point being that black will now play knight f6 with tempo, hitting e4 and d5, and further to crumble the white centre. In fact, Arkle played quite imaginatively here. He played knight g5, and Miles responded with h6, reaching the critical point of the game. At this point, white dropped back with knight h3, and after the good move queen h4, black was already putting considerable pressure on the white centre. Knight f6 can follow next move, and the pawn centre is crumbling. But if we go back to move 16, a better defence for white was to have advanced simply with d6, threatening the bishop on d7, and if black takes on e4, white recaptures with an unclear situation. A more respectful treatment of kangaroos is if you just fianchetto the white king bishop, for example, knight f3, knight h6. And perhaps it's worth noting at this point that if you don't want to play a kangaroo, but something more akin to a Queen's Indian defence, then knight to f6 is transposing back into more normal waters. Or indeed, if you want to be somewhere in between the two, the move f5, to be followed by knight f6. But knight f6 here is leading you back to established opening theory. Knight h6 is a bit more out in the wilds. Now d5, conferring a distinctly unusual character upon the opening, nothing like a Queen's Indian defence now. Castling, and to avoid the dismantling effect of the pawn centre that comes after e4, which we just saw, g3, because now the knight, h6, and the bishop, indeed the other knight, all the black pieces, have less to bite on. So it's a question of black coming up with a development of sorts from here. Knight a6, other knight goes to the edge of the board. Don't worry, they're not going to stay there for long, either of them. Knight f5. Knight d6. Pretty unusual beast. Well, this curious sequence has actually occurred a couple of times at Grandmaster level. On its first appearance, Mr. Brenninkmeier chose to defend the threat to his c-pawn from Mr. van der Wiel's knight with b3. Other knight came into c5, a bit more centralised. Brenninkmeier tried knight e5, and van der Wiel came up with a very good plan indeed here. He took on d5 to open the e-file. White took back with a knight. Rook e8 with tempo. Knight dropped back to d3, and now knight from c5 to e4, making use of the ef files and the e4 square. Queen c2, bishop takes d5. Not the only plan, but quite an effective one. White took back, and van der Wiel played f5, cementing that knight there on e4. There are no structural defects at all in black's position here, and he has a perfectly satisfactory middle game to look forward to. Another way of defending the c-pawn is queen d4. This actually happened in a game between two ex-junior world champions, Kurt Hansen and Tony Miles, at Biel in 1992. Miles played queen to f6. Quite a good idea when you're in a cramped position to exchange off pieces. Hansen took. Doubling of the black f-pawns doesn't matter so much. His control of the centre is quite good. pawn structure is compact. Knight d2 to hold the pawn, and Miles went f5. Perhaps the most serious challenge to the health of the kangaroo was seen in the treatment which ex-world champion Anatoly Karpov gave it when he played Tony Miles at Biel in 1992. After e4, knight h6, he took the broadest pawn centre he could get with f4. Miles hit back immediately with the characteristic English and kangaroo jump, f5. e5 played Karpov. Knight to f7, and now a move you only rarely see at move 9 in Karpov's games. Castle's queenside. And really the only consistent strategy for black is to try to get in the g5 lever, which Miles played now. But Karpov showed his great versatility and all-round understanding of chess. Played knight f3 and was able to demonstrate in most variations leading from here a clear superiority to white. For example, if g4, then knight to e1, and white retains a big central spatial majority. Miles actually preferred rook g8, but bishop e2 was an excellent reply, involving, if necessary, the sacrifice of the g2 pawn, but only at the expense of a tremendous initiative for white. For example, if g takes f4, white recaptures, black takes on g2, white has more than adequate compensation after rook h to g1, the black king already beginning to look a bit drafty. So Miles preferred to develop a piece with knight a6, and Karpov continued very logically and consistently with h3, intending to blast open lines on the king side. Miles took on f4. If he hadn't done that, white plays g4 anyway. Took back with the queen, once again capturing on g2, very dangerous because of rook g1. So queen e7, preparing to castle queenside. Karpov played g4, threatening the pawn on f5. Miles took. White recaptured, and now the h pawn is on prise down the newly opened h file. That explains knight g5, also hoping to exploit the pin. But Karpov's next move is excellent. He plays d5, drowning out the bishop and consolidating his spatial superiority in the centre. Black took on f3, white took back, black castled. And it might look as though most of black's difficulties are behind him, since he succeeded in exchanging off a pair of minor pieces. He's not so cramped, but Karpov shows what a wonderful master of strategy he is. Rook h6, rook to g7, rook f6. The domination theme, a recurrent theme in the games of Anatoly Karpov, to dominate the other side's pieces by putting yours on more active squares. This game, to my mind, represents perhaps model play by white versus the kangaroo. But as some of the other examples I trust have illustrated, if your opponents aren't quite of the positional genius of Anatoly Karpov, then the system, with its counter-attacking themes of f5, familiar method of dismantling a white centre we've seen so often in the English defence proper, and bringing the knight to h6, exchanging the pair of bishops on d2 to avoid the cramp, gives reasonable counter chances for black.
Well, I think I've shown you in this video that most of the ideas in the English defence, which were conceived in the 1970s, are still valid, and also that there are quite a few new ones just waiting to be tried out. It's an opening I've played for a number of years with success, and I intend to do so in the future.